Welcome back to the Sleepy Poker Masterclass, Beginner to Master. In this 8th lesson, we explore how to defend against bluffs in Texas Hold'em. You'll learn how to identify false aggression, read patterns that reveal weakness, and make confident decisions when facing pressure. By the end of this lesson, you'll understand when to stand firm, when to fold, and how to turn an opponent's bluff into your profit. Chapter 1. The Psychology of Defense. Every poker player faces moments of uncertainty. You hold a decent hand, your opponent bets big, and your mind begins to race. Are they strong, or are they bluffing? This mental struggle is part of poker's essence. To defend against bluffs, you must first master your own emotions. Defensive play starts with composure. When chips are in the pot and pressure rises, panic clouds judgment. Calm players think clearly. They compare the facts, the betting pattern, the board, the opponent's style, before making a decision. Emotional players see only fear. They fold too quickly or call too loosely. Emotional balance is the first layer of defense. Patience is the second. You cannot call every bet or fight every bluff. Good defense means waiting for spots where logic supports your decisions. Folding to strong aggression can be correct, even if you later learn your opponent was bluffing. Over time, discipline protects far more chips than curiosity ever wins. Another key is perspective. When opponents bluff, they are testing your perception of reality. They are telling a story and asking whether you believe it. Your job is not to react emotionally, but to analyze that story. Does it make sense? Does the betting sequence fit the type of hand they represent? Strong defenders treat poker as investigation, not confrontation. Confidence plays a vital role too. Many players call out of frustration or fear of being bluffed. That mindset turns defense into revenge. Confidence means knowing that folding can be powerful. It also means trusting your reads when logic tells you the bluff is likely. Confidence lets you respond with authority instead of anxiety. The psychology of defense also involves emotional detachment from individual hands. Winning or losing one pot does not define success. Every call or fold is just one decision in a larger system. When you detach emotionally, you can think objectively about long-term results. Over hundreds of hands, correct decisions add up far more than short-term outcomes. Finally, good defenders use observation to control emotion. Watching others calmly while staying silent allows valuable information to surface. Notice who gets nervous under pressure, who talks too much, and who avoids eye contact. Patience and awareness transform defense from reaction into preparation. The mind is the real battleground in poker. Bluffs win not because of cards, but because of reactions. The players who remain calm, logical, and patient turn that psychological pressure into opportunity. In this lesson, we'll learn how to recognize when the story doesn't add up, and how to keep your emotions from writing a bad ending. Chapter 2. Recognizing bluff patterns. Spotting bluffing patterns turns confusion into confidence. While every player bluffs differently, most follow predictable habits. Learning to recognize those habits gives you the power to separate truth from fiction. The first step is to understand storytelling in poker. Every bet tells a story. A strong player's bets progress logically through the streets, reflecting believable hand development. A bluffer's bets often contradict themselves. They tell a story that falls apart when examined closely. For example, an opponent raises pre-flop and bets heavily on a low flop, like 5-6-2. On the turn they check, then suddenly fire a large river bet. When a high card appears, the story doesn't fit. What strong hands check the turn, only to overbet the river on a card that helps your range more than theirs? That inconsistency often signals weakness. Another common bluff pattern is sudden aggression after passivity. A player checks through multiple streets and then bets large when the pot is small. This shift in behavior rarely represents strength. It usually shows desperation. Bluffers often get impatient when a hand drags on without resolution. Pay attention to bet sizing. Small flop bets, followed by large river bets, often indicate missed draws or overcompensation. The bet grows not because the hand improved, but because the bluffer wants to force a fold. Conversely, consistent sizing across streets usually reflects real value. Timing is also part of the pattern. Quick bets can mean confidence, but they can also mean fear. Some bluffers act instantly, to avoid thinking. Others take too long, trying to appear deliberate. The key is consistency. If their timing changes dramatically between streets, something has shifted, often their comfort level. Watch for repeated behavior. Players who bluff successfully once often try it again soon after, especially if they gained confidence. Likewise, those caught bluffing may go quiet for a while. Understanding these emotional rhythms helps you predict when bluffs are more or less likely. Finally, remember that bluffing patterns don't exist in isolation. Always connect them to the board, position, and player type. A bluff pattern that works in one situation might be meaningless in another. Context is everything. Recognizing bluff patterns takes practice. The more you observe, the clearer the differences become between believable stories and broken ones. Over time, you'll begin to see bluffs not as surprises, but as signatures, predictable expressions of habit waiting to be read. Chapter 3: Reading Timing and Tempo. Timing tells are among the most subtle but reliable clues in poker. Every player has a rhythm, and that rhythm changes under stress. By observing how long an opponent takes to act, you can often detect hesitation, uncertainty, or false confidence. Learning to read these patterns gives you valuable information without seeing a single card. Start with consistency. Each player develops a natural tempo. Some act quickly. Others take their time. The key is not the speed itself, but the change in speed. When a player suddenly acts faster or slower than usual, that break in rhythm reveals something about their comfort level. A fast bet can signal confidence or fear. Some players bet quickly because they have a strong hand and see no reason to wait. Others bet fast to appear strong, hoping speed will discourage calls. The difference lies in how the timing fits their overall pattern. If a typically cautious player fires instantly on a difficult board, that often suggests bluffing. They are using speed to mask uncertainty. A long pause before betting can be equally revealing. Many bluffers hesitate, trying to decide if their story is believable. The longer the delay, the more likely the player is building courage, rather than counting value combinations. In contrast, value bettors usually know what they want to do and act naturally. Watch the rhythm between streets of betting. Bluffers often act inconsistently. They might bet quickly on the flop, pause too long on the turn, and then shove immediately on the river. Each change reflects doubt or improvisation. Strong hands flow more smoothly from one street to the next. Online, timing tells are still powerful. Instant bets after the flop can indicate pre-planned continuation bets. Long tanking before small bets often shows weakness. A player who snaps calls the flop, but tanks on the turn, may have hit a piece of the board but feels uncertain about future aggression. Every timing shift adds to your read. In live play, combine timing with physical observation. Quick breathing before a bet or sudden stillness after one can signal tension. A player who reaches for chips early may have already decided to bluff. The key is to notice the difference between natural behavior and performance. However, beware of false tells. Experienced players know how to manipulate timing to confuse you. They might pause deliberately with a strong hand, or act fast with a bluff to create a trap. Never rely on timing alone. Always connect it with board texture, bet sizing, and previous behavior. Timing tells are not about speed. They are about comfort. When a player's rhythm breaks, something has changed. Reading that change with logic and patience turns timing into one of your most reliable defensive tools. Chapter 4: Understanding Player Types. Every opponent falls into a category based on how they play their hands. Recognizing these types helps you adjust instantly and defend more effectively. Bluffing tendencies change with personality. Knowing what motivates each player saves chips and builds profit. The first group is the tight passive player. These players avoid risk. They play few hands and rarely bluff. When they bet, they usually mean it. Defending against them is simple. Believe their story. If they show aggression, fold your marginal hands. Trying to catch bluffs here wastes chips because they almost never bluff. Next are tight aggressive players, often called tags. They play fewer hands but bet strongly when involved. Tags use selective, structured bluffs. They continuation bet often on favorable boards, but slow down when conditions worsen. To defend against them, analyze board texture. When their aggression fits the board, respect it. When it does not, consider calling down lighter. Loose passive players are the classic calling stations. They play many hands but rarely raise. Bluffing against them is pointless, but defending is easy. Simply value bet, strong hands, and fold weak ones. They rarely apply pressure through bluffs, so there is little need for complicated defense. Then come the loose aggressive players, or lags. These opponents are the most dangerous bluffers. They thrive on pressure and constantly test your resolve. Against them, patience is critical. Do not fight every hand. Choose your battles. Wait for clear evidence that their story does not add up. Once you find inconsistency, call them down. Lags rely on volume, discipline beats them. Another type is the emotional or tilted player. These players act out of frustration rather than logic. Their bluffs are impulsive, not calculated. You can identify them by rapid betting, size, or visible irritation. Against tilt, stay calm. Let them keep firing. When you have a decent hand, call. Their aggression eventually works against them. Online, player types are reflected through stats and tendencies. Tight players have low pre-flop raise percentages. Loose players enter many pots. Aggressive players have high continuation bet rates. Study these patterns through observation or tracking software, if available. Defending against bluffs means matching your response to the personality behind the bet. Some players bluff from calculation. Others bluff from emotion. Some barely bluff at all. Adjust your defense to fit the opponent rather than forcing one strategy onto everyone. Understanding player types is like knowing the rules of each conversation. Once you recognize who is speaking, their words, meaning their bets, become easier to interpret. And when you can read the speaker, you control the table. Chapter 5. The role of position in defense. Position is just as important when defending as it is when attacking. Where you sit at the table changes how much information you have and how you can use it. The later you act, the more data you collect from others' decisions. That knowledge turns defense into strategy instead of guesswork. When you are in position, meaning you act after your opponent, you hold a major advantage. You see their timing, bet size, and behavior before you decide. This gives you time to process logic instead of emotion. If an opponent fires multiple barrels, you can judge whether their story fits the texture of the board. You also control the final bet on each street, allowing you to slow the pot or end the hand when you choose. In position, defense often feels calm. You can call down with marginal hands when logic supports it, because you see the full picture of the hand as it develops. You can also use your position to bluff catch on the river. When your opponent bets after showing weakness earlier, you can decide whether the story holds together. If it doesn't, calling with medium strength can be profitable. When you are out of position, everything becomes harder. You act first, meaning you must make decisions without knowing what your opponent will do next. Bluffers exploit this by applying constant pressure. They bet more often because they know you have less information. The key to defense out of position is structure and discipline. Out of position defense starts pre-flop. Playing too many hands from early seats puts you in difficult spots later. Tighten your range when you will act first. Post-flop, focus on pot control. Avoid building large pots with medium-strength hands. Small, deliberate checks and calls give you flexibility while preventing opponents from exploiting your position. If you sense a bluff, gather every clue before reacting. Compare their current aggression to previous hands. Look at how the board interacts with their pre-flop range. When the story breaks, consider a well-timed call or even a check raise. But never force action just because you are tired of folding. Position gives power to your decisions. In position, you can defend confidently because you have information. Out of position, you must rely on patience and careful observation. The best defenders use both sides of the table wisely, protecting chips in the blinds and striking decisively from the button. Chapter 6. The Math of Calling Down. Defending against bluffs is not only about reading people. It is also about numbers. Every decision in poker has a mathematical side, and calling down against aggression is no exception. Knowing the math behind your calls prevents emotional mistakes and keeps your play consistent over time. The most basic concept is pot odds. Pot odds tell you how often your hand needs to win to justify a call. You compare the size of the bet you must call to the total pot after you call. For example, if the pot is $100 and your opponent bets 50, you are calling 50 to win 200. 50 divided by 200 equals 25%. That means you need to win 1 in 4 times for your call to break even. If you believe your opponent is bluffing more often than that, calling is profitable. If they bluff less, folding saves you money. This math creates discipline. You no longer call because of curiosity. You call because the numbers make sense. The next step is understanding minimum defense frequency, or MDF. This concept shows how often you must defend against bets to prevent opponents from profiting with automatic bluffs. For a half-pot bet, your MDF is 67%. That means you should continue with your hand 2 out of 3 times, either by calling or raising. If you fold more often, opponents can bluff with any 2 cards and show a long-term profit. You do not need to memorize these percentages perfectly. What matters is understanding the logic. Larger bets require you to defend less often, while smaller bets require more frequent calls. The bigger the bet, the higher the risk for your opponent, which balances the equation naturally. When deciding to call down, combine math with logic. Start by asking if the story fits. If the bluff seems possible, check the pot odds. Then decide whether the call aligns with your overall strategy. Each step removes emotion from the process. Avoid hero calls driven by pride. Calling to prove a point rarely ends well. Instead, trust the numbers and the patterns. When the math supports the call, make it confidently. When it doesn't, fold without regret. The math of calling down builds structure in chaos. It turns emotional decisions into logical ones and teaches you to protect your chips with precision. The more you rely on numbers, the less control fear has over your game. Chapter 7. Bet sizing as a clue. Every bet in poker tells a story, and the size of that bet reveals much about its purpose. Understanding how to interpret bet sizing gives you one of the strongest tools for detecting bluffs. When you combine sizing with board texture, timing, and position, you can often identify when a player's actions are inconsistent with their supposed strength. The first principle is consistency. Skilled players keep their bet sizes steady across different situations. When a player suddenly deviates from their usual pattern, something often changes in their confidence. A sudden overbet from someone who usually bets small, or a timid bet from an aggressive player, should catch your attention. Consistency, or the lack of it, often separates truth from fiction. Small bets can serve several purposes. Value bettors use them to extract thin profit from weaker hands. Bluffers use them to appear strong while risking less. A small bet on a scary board might look like a trap, but it can also be a defensive move meant to end the hand cheaply. When opponents use small bets in spots where strong hands would normally bet large, the story may not hold up. Large bets create pressure. Bluffers often overcompensate by betting big, trying to force folds instead of earning them. However, strong players also use large bets for value. The difference lies in context. A large bet that fits the story of a premium hand deserves respect. A large bet that arrives suddenly, with no consistent narrative, often masks weakness. Pay attention to progression across streets. Logical bet sizing grows steadily. For example, a player might bet 1/3 pot on the flop, half pot on the turn, and 2/3 on the river. That rhythm makes sense for both value and balanced play. But if the pattern shifts, such as a small flop bet, followed by an oversized turn bet, it signals uncertainty. The player may be testing your reaction rather than following a clear plan. Stack size adds another layer. Bluffers sometimes bet amounts that leave them with awkward stacks. For example, they might bet half their remaining chips, putting themselves in a poor position if called. Value bettors rarely do this. Their bet sizes usually preserve flexibility for future streets. Finally, remember that sizing alone is not proof. Some experienced players intentionally vary their bets to confuse you. Always link bet sizing clues with other factors: position, timing, and the board itself. Bet sizing is the voice of a hand. Strong hands speak clearly and calmly. Weak ones shout too loud or whisper too soon. Listen closely, and the truth reveals itself. Chapter 8: Detecting Story Inconsistencies. Poker is a game of storytelling. Each bet and call describes what a player wants you to believe. Defending against bluffs means testing whether that story makes sense from start to finish. Bluffers often build their tales carelessly. When details don't align, the story collapses under pressure. Begin by tracking the timeline of aggression. If an opponent raises pre-flop and bets the flop, the line should continue logically through later streets. When aggression stops suddenly or restarts without reason, something is off. A player who checks a strong turn and then fires big on a blank river rarely holds a monster. More often, they are trying to reclaim the pot after missing their draw. Look for contradictions between action and texture. Imagine a flop of 8, 9, and 10 with two suits. If your opponent represents a strong hand, they should have many draws in their range. When they check the flop and raise the turn, the story feels unnatural. A hand that truly connected would often bet earlier. Bluffers rely on delayed aggression, hoping later pressure will rewrite the story. Inconsistency also shows in bet sizing. A small bet on a wet flop, followed by a huge bet on a safe turn, often means the opponent is trying to scare you rather than protect a made hand. Strong hands usually bet big when danger exists, not after it passes. Pay attention to position and initiative. When an out-of-position player starts leading after calling the flop, it can be suspicious. Ask yourself what improved for them. If the new card changes nothing, the sudden aggression likely represents weakness. Players who hold real strength tend to stay consistent from one street to the next. Another key sign of inconsistency is impossible representation. Sometimes bluffers forget what they are pretending to have. A player who checks pre-flop and then raises hard on a flop full of high cards cannot logically represent aces or kings. Their actions contradict the ranges they would have shown aggression with earlier. Consistency builds credibility. Bluffers lose that credibility when they improvise mid-hand. Their bets no longer follow a coherent line of logic, and those contradictions are your invitation to call. When you detect a broken story, verify it with context. Compare the hand to what you know about the player. If they tend to bet draws aggressively, their sudden passivity followed by aggression later becomes a clear red flag. Defending against bluffs is not about guessing. It is about listening to the story and identifying where it falls apart. Every hand tells a narrative. The more carefully you read it, the easier it becomes to know when fiction replaces truth. Chapter 9: Emotional Triggers and Over-Aggression. Bluffing often begins as logic, but turns into emotion. Players who lose control of their feelings start bluffing for the wrong reasons. Understanding emotional triggers helps you recognize when aggression is no longer rational. Once you learn these signs, you can detect bluffs before they happen. One common trigger is frustration. After losing a big pot or missing several draws in a row, players feel the urge to win back what they lost. They start forcing situations that are not favorable. When you see a player take a tough beat and suddenly raise or bet heavily in the next hand, stay alert. Their focus has shifted from logic to revenge. Another trigger is ego. Some players cannot stand being outplayed. When an opponent calls them down or wins several small pots, pride takes over. They bluff to reassert dominance, not because the cards support it. Ego-driven bluffs often appear as large, dramatic bets meant to prove something. When someone suddenly overbets in a spot where a normal bet would suffice, the motive is often emotional. Tilt combines frustration and ego into one dangerous state. A tilted player plays faster, louder, and less carefully. Their bet sizing becomes erratic, and their patience disappears. These players are easy to exploit because their emotions override strategy. They fire second and third barrels without thinking through the story. When you recognize tilt, stay calm. Let them dig their own hole. Fear can also trigger bluffs, though it may seem strange. Some players bluff not from aggression, but from panic. They fear being seen as weak, so they bet big to avoid showing uncertainty. This fear bluff often happens on the river, when a missed draw leaves them with nothing but nerves. A sudden large bet, after previous hesitation, usually signals this pattern. Learn to read emotional patterns over time. You can spot when a player's behavior changes from logical to reactive. Rapid chip movements, sighs, shaking hands, or nervous chatter all signal tension. Even online, hesitation after losing a big hand, followed by instant aggression in the next round, often means emotion is in control. Your best defense is composure. Emotions spread across a table like ripples in water. Stay calm when others lose balance. Emotional players rely on chaos to win. If you remain steady, you control the rhythm. Spotting emotional triggers turns defense into opportunity. Each sign of frustration or fear gives you permission to call lighter and trust your read. Over time, emotional awareness protects your chips as effectively as any mathematical calculation. Chapter 10. Using your image to invite bluffs. Not all bluffs should be avoided. Sometimes, the best way to profit from them is to invite them. When opponents see you as tight and cautious, they will try to test you. By maintaining that image deliberately, you create traps that turn their aggression into your gain. A tight image forms naturally when you play fewer hands and show down strong cards. After a while, opponents assume you are incapable of calling light or bluffing yourself. They begin bluffing you more often, especially when the pot grows large. This is where your preparation pays off. To invite bluffs, control your table image intentionally. Start by playing solid, disciplined poker for a stretch of time. Fold weak hands. Show strong ones. Speak calmly and avoid reacting emotionally. Let opponents believe you are safe to attack. Once that perception sets in, they will start bluffing into your strength. When you notice their aggression increase, switch gears. Begin calling more often with medium-strength hands. These are the moments when logic beats reputation. If your opponent's story seems exaggerated or disconnected from the board, trust your tight image. They are likely bluffing because of how you appear, not because of what they hold. You can also manipulate image through timing. Take a little longer before calling, as if you are unsure. Show hesitation even when you plan to call. Bluffers interpret hesitation as weakness and may fire again on later streets. When you call again, the trap closes naturally. Another way to invite bluffs is through checking strong hands. Instead of betting with top pair or better, check to your opponent. Many players view checks as surrender. They respond with aggression, trying to steal what they think is unprotected. A A calm call at that moment can win large pots, while reinforcing your reputation as too tight to trap. Balance remains important. If you always slow play, observant opponents will adjust. Mix in some regular bets with your checks to stay unpredictable. The goal is not to act weak every time, but to choose moments where your image gives you maximum payoff. Inviting bluffs requires confidence and patience. You must trust your read and resist the urge to chase every small pot. Let opponents build their own traps through overconfidence. In poker, few things are more satisfying than catching a bluff that you quietly encouraged. Chapter 11. Calling with Marginal Hands. Calling with marginal hands is one of the hardest skills in poker. These hands sit in the gray area between strong and weak, and deciding what to do with them often defines long-term success. Good players do not avoid marginal spots. They learn to manage them with logic and control. A marginal hand is one that can beat bluffs but loses to most value bets. Examples include middle pairs, weak top pairs, or second-best hands on coordinated boards. These hands rarely feel comfortable, but they often provide the right opportunity to catch a bluff. The first step is context. Before making a tough call, review how the hand developed. Did your opponent's aggression make sense from pre-flop to river? If their story feels inconsistent, your marginal hand gains strength. But if every bet fits a believable line, folding is often correct. You are not calling because you hope to win. You are calling because logic says you are likely ahead. Pot odds also guide the decision. If you are facing a small river bet, you don't need to win very often to justify calling. For example, if the pot is $100 and your opponent bets 20, you need to win only once in 6 times. A hand like second pair might be enough in that situation. Small bets often signal weakness, so trust the math when the price is right. Position matters too. When you act last, you can observe your opponent's behavior before deciding. Marginal hands gain value when you control the final action. In position, you can safely call down lighter because you see how confidently your opponent bets. Out of position, it's harder. Without full information, calling marginally can lead to mistakes. Avoid emotional calls. Players often convince themselves they are due to win a pot. That mindset turns logic into hope. Instead, base every call on structure, pot odds, hand strength, and betting patterns. Calling down with discipline means losing small when wrong, and winning big when right. Finally, use observation over ego. You don't need to be right every time to profit. Catching a few well-timed bluffs over a long session makes a significant difference. Marginal hands become profitable, not through luck, but through precision. When played with patience, these hands defend your range and stop opponents from bluffing you freely. Each correct call adds quiet confidence. You no longer fear uncertainty. You understand it. Chapter 12. Balancing your own range. Defending against bluffs does not stop at reading others. You must also manage how your own play looks to them. If you fold too often, opponents will exploit you. If you call too easily, they will value bet relentlessly. Balance keeps your opponents uncertain, and uncertainty keeps you safe. A balanced range means mixing your actions with both strong and weak hands. For example, when facing a continuation bet, you might call sometimes with top pair and sometimes with draws or medium pairs. This blend hides your intentions. Your opponent cannot tell whether your call means strength or curiosity. Balance begins with awareness. Track your own tendencies, just as you study others. Ask yourself, do I fold too much to aggression, or do I call too often with weak hands? The answer changes as the table changes. Tight tables reward more calls. Loose games demand more folds. Adjust your defense to match the environment. When you balance correctly, opponents cannot bluff profitably. They do not know which part of your range they are facing. Suppose you defend the big blind and call a flop bet, with both strong top pairs and some weaker draws. When your opponent bets the turn, they must respect both possibilities. This uncertainty limits how freely they can bluff. Balance also protects your image. Folding every time you face aggression makes you predictable. Bluffers thrive on predictable players. Calling occasionally with medium hands, even if it costs small losses, keeps your image resilient. Opponents will think twice before trying to bully you. Do not confuse balance with perfection. You do not need to defend every hand in perfect ratios. The goal is flexibility. When opponents notice that you adapt, they stop attacking automatically. Flexibility discourages exploitation more effectively than rigid precision. Position again plays a role. In position, you can defend more often and still stay balanced. Out of position, a tighter range maintains structure. The difference lies in the information available to you. Balanced defense takes practice. It requires letting go of emotional habits and building decisions on logic. Over time, it becomes natural. You'll fold when the story makes sense, call when the math supports it, and mix your range often enough to stay unreadable. Poker rewards players who make others uncomfortable. Balance is what makes you unpredictable. And unpredictability is the greatest defense of all. Chapter 13. Detecting double and triple barrel bluffs. A double or triple barrel bluff occurs when a player continues betting on the flop, turn, and sometimes the river without a made hand. These bluffs can be intimidating because the consistent aggression feels convincing. But even multi-street pressure follows patterns, and learning to read them transforms fear into confidence. The first key is story consistency. Ask whether the opponent's line makes sense from one street to the next. On the flop, they represent a range of strong hands. On the turn, their story should continue logically. If the turn card does not help their supposed range, yet they keep betting, the story weakens. For example, if the flop is ace, 10, 4, and the turn is a 9, an opponent who barrels again might not actually have an ace. That new card connects better with your calling range than theirs. Watch for scare cards. Double and triple barrels rely on using high or coordinated cards that appear dangerous. A player who bets big when an ace or king hits may be leveraging fear rather than strength. Compare how quickly and confidently they act. True value hands often take a moment of thought, while bluffs fire instantly to maintain pressure. Bet sizing also tells a story. Consistent sizing across all streets feels credible. But erratic patterns, small bets followed by oversized ones, suggest improvisation. Bluffers frequently change sizes mid-hand when uncertainty grows. The bigger the bet without clear logic, the more likely it's emotional aggression rather than structured play. Position influences how multi-street bluffs appear. Players in position can control the pace, applying pressure because they act last. But out-of-position barrels require confidence and strong storytelling. When you face repeated aggression from early position, question whether the player truly has enough strong combinations to justify it. Often they don't. Patience is your defense. When you call a flop and turn bet, your opponent expects you to fold. Many bluffs crumble when faced with steady resistance. If the board does not drastically change on the river, a well-timed call can expose the entire sequence. Look for breaks in rhythm. Bluffers sometimes hesitate before their final barrel, debating whether to finish the story. True value hands move smoothly from start to finish. The hesitation reveals doubt. Double and triple barrels are meant to intimidate. They rely on your discomfort, not superior cards. When you stay calm, compare logic to pattern, and trust your analysis, those once frightening bluffs lose their power. Chapter 14. The importance of board texture. Board texture determines how believable a bluff really is. Understanding how different card combinations affect ranges helps you decide when aggression makes sense and when it doesn't. Defense starts with reading the board, not just the opponent. A dry board contains cards that don't connect. Examples include Ace 7-2 or King 10-3 Rainbow. On these boards, the pre-flop raiser usually has the range advantage. When they bet, their story sounds believable. However, if that same player keeps firing on later streets without improvement, start questioning the logic. There are few cards that change the situation, and continued aggression might be more bluff than value. A wet board is the opposite. These flops have straight and flush possibilities, such as 10-9-8 with two suits. On such textures, many hands connect, which makes bluffs harder to sell. If an opponent barrels aggressively on a wet board, their range must be very strong or very brave. Defenders should call more often in these situations, because the odds of them missing are higher. Turn and river cards change everything. A scare card, like an ace or a third suited card, can shift perceived advantage. Good players use these cards to continue bluffing. To defend correctly, ask whether that card logically improves their range or yours. For instance, if a third heart lands, and you know the opponent rarely bets flush draws, their new aggression is suspicious. Compare each bet to the evolving story of the board. If an opponent bets strongly when the board favors your range, such as when low cards complete possible straights, it might be a bluff. Most players prefer to check in these moments with real value to control the pot size. Texture also affects bet sizing. On dry boards, smaller bets make sense. On wet boards, larger bets are needed to deny equity. When you see the opposite, tiny bets on dangerous textures or huge bets on harmless ones, your alarm should sound. Bluffers often misunderstand texture and bet incorrectly for the situation. Board reading also helps prevent overreactions. Many players panic when scary cards appear. A flush card on the river might complete a draw, but if your opponent's range included few of those draws to begin with, it changes little. Stay logical. Evaluate probability, not fear. The more you understand texture, the more clearly you can see through false aggression. The cards on the table don't just build hands, they tell stories. When that story doesn't fit, your calm, logical defense turns confusion into profit. Chapter 15. Reading bet sequencing. Every hand in poker unfolds like a conversation. Each bet and check forms a sentence that reveals intention. When you learn to read that sequence, you can identify when a player's story makes sense and when it begins to fall apart. Bet sequencing means studying how actions connect from street to street. A logical sequence reflects consistency. A flawed one exposes weakness. Strong players plan their hands before the flop, already knowing which textures they will bet, check, or give up on. Bluffers often improvise. Their decisions shift as pressure increases, creating patterns that stand out. Start by tracking who showed aggression first. The pre-flop raiser usually represents strength. If they continue betting on the flop and turn, that story feels credible. But if a player who called pre-flop suddenly becomes aggressive on a board that doesn't fit their range, suspicion is justified. Their sequence doesn't follow the natural flow of strong hands. Timing between streets offers more clues. A smooth, steady pace usually comes from confidence. Hesitation between bets often signals uncertainty. Bluffers tend to stall on later streets as the pot grows, debating whether to continue the act. Their inconsistency gives you the advantage. Observe changes in bet size. A sequence that grows logically, small on the flop, medium on the turn, larger on the river, feels believable. A sudden shift, like a tiny flop bet, followed by an oversized turn shove, often means the player is trying to regain control of the narrative. Bluffers frequently use oversized bets to rewrite a weak story. Pay attention to action reversals. For example, a player who checks the flop, bets the turn, and then checks again on the river, often lacks a clear plan. Real value hands follow steady aggression. Disjointed sequences, with aggression appearing and disappearing, suggest uncertainty or missed draws. You can also learn from previous behavior. Some players have predictable lines. They might always continuation bet the flop, but slow down after being called. Others double barrel, often, but rarely triple barrel. Recognizing these habits helps you anticipate when aggression is genuine or forced. When you study sequencing, think like a storyteller. Ask whether each action fits the hand they claim to have. If their words don't match their actions, their story collapses. Calling in these moments isn't a gamble, it's reasoned defense. Every bet is a sentence. Every sequence is a story. Listen closely, and you'll start hearing which ones are true and which are fiction. Chapter 16. Live tells and physical cues. In live poker, information hides in more than just chips and cards. Every player reveals subtle physical clues. These cues, known as tells, can help you identify when an opponent is bluffing or strong. The key is to observe patterns calmly and avoid overreacting to single moments. The most reliable tells come from inconsistency. A player's natural behavior is steady. When that rhythm changes, something inside them has shifted. Watch for signs of tension or relaxation. Many players act one way when strong, and the opposite when weak. For example, nervous chatter often covers discomfort during a bluff, while quiet, steady breathing usually signals confidence. Hands and posture provide early hints. A player who suddenly sits upright or freezes after betting may be uneasy. Others fidget, shuffle chips rapidly, or avoid eye contact when bluffing. Some may do the opposite, stare at you intensely to appear strong. The trick is to spot what is normal for that person first. Once you know their baseline, any break from it becomes meaningful. Timing is another live clue. Quick bets often mean premeditated bluffs. They want to appear certain before fear catches up. Long pauses followed by small bets may show hesitation or weakness. Notice whether they act quickly in every hand, or only when under pressure. Verbal behavior can be revealing. Over-explaining, joking, or repeating phrases like, "You can fold if you want," are signs of anxiety. Confident players usually say little. When someone starts talking mid-hand, they're often trying to influence your decision instead of relying on their cards. Watch chip handling. Players who bet confidently move chips smoothly and deliberately. Bluffers often handle chips awkwardly or hesitate before pushing them forward. Sometimes they grab too many chips and then adjust at the last second, a nervous attempt to appear natural. However, no single tell is perfect. Some experienced players use reverse tells, acting weak with strong hands or strong with weak ones. Always cross-check physical cues with betting patterns and logic. A tell is a supporting clue, not proof on its own. The best defenders observe without judgment. Keep your breathing slow and your posture relaxed. When you are calm, others reveal more. You see what tension hides in their movements, hear what nervousness adds to their voice, and sense what fear does to their timing. Physical observation deepens your awareness. It turns each poker hand into a study of human behavior. When paired with logic and math, these small details complete the full picture of defense. Chapter 17. Online Bluff Indicators. Online poker removes physical tells, but it replaces them with digital ones. Timing, sizing, and frequency become your eyes and ears. Bluffing still follows patterns. They just look different behind a screen. Once you know what to watch for, the lack of physical presence becomes an advantage, not a limitation. The first and most powerful clue is timing. Instant actions often reveal pre-planned decisions. When a player bets the flop immediately after it appears, that bet was already in their mind. It might be a standard continuation bet, or it might be automatic aggression without thought. Slow reactions, on the other hand, show hesitation. A long pause followed by a small bet often signals uncertainty, a possible bluff or weak attempt to take the pot. Pay attention to bet sizing across multiple hands. Many online bluffers fall into patterns. Some bluff small, afraid of losing chips. Others bluff large, hoping to end the hand quickly. Because the environment feels less personal, players lean into extremes. Tracking these sizing habits gives you insight into who is balanced and who is emotional. Frequency is another key factor. Some players continuation bet almost every flop. Against them, your defense should be patient and mathematical. If they bet nearly 100% of the time, your calling range widens automatically. Other players rarely bluff twice. Once you call their flop bet, they shut down on the turn. Take notes. Frequency data is one of the few certainties online play provides. Use software tools or mental tracking to notice these trends. Even casual note-taking makes a difference. Write down how often someone fires multiple barrels, how large their bets are on each street, and how often they follow through on the river. Small sample sizes can mislead you, but repeated behavior tells the truth. Timing between actions also matters. When a player calls quickly on one street but tanks on the next, that rhythm break means something. Fast calls often represent draws or weak pairs. Long pauses before aggression show indecision. Bluffers online hesitate too, they just do it digitally. Finally, stay aware of stack depth and situation. Short-stacked players bluff less because they can't afford to. Deep stacks encourage more creative aggression. Watch how their comfort with chips changes their strategy. Online, every piece of information is numerical or mechanical. You can't see their face, but you can still read their patterns. The key is patience and precision. Data becomes instinct, and instinct becomes control. Chapter 18: Turning Defense into Offense. Good defense doesn't mean constant caution. Sometimes the best way to counter a bluff is to seize the initiative. By turning defense into offense, you shift the pressure back onto your opponent. The key is timing, choosing moments when the board, position, and logic support a bold response. The most common form of offensive defense is the check raise. You allow the opponent to bet first, then raise their bluff. This move forces them to prove strength immediately. It works best when the board favors your range, or when their story seems inconsistent. For example, if the flop comes low and disconnected, and your opponent continues betting aggressively after raising pre-flop, a check raise can expose their imbalance. You can also use float calls to set up later aggression. A float is when you call a flop bet, intending to take the pot away on the turn. You let your opponent's bluff continue for one street, then strike when they show hesitation. This method is especially effective in position. When they check the next street, your bet often wins uncontested. Timing remains everything. Never attack blindly. Choose moments when your opponent's actions clearly contradict a believable hand. On boards that miss their likely range, a check raise or delayed bluff can flip the script instantly. Stack depth matters here too. Deep stacks allow you to apply sustained pressure. Shallow stacks limit flexibility because you risk committing too much. Always calculate how many chips you are willing to invest before turning defense into attack. Body language and timing cues can also signal when to act. In live play, sudden stillness after betting often means weakness. Online, long pauses, followed by small bets, reveal doubt. When you sense that hesitation, calculated aggression becomes your strongest weapon. Another form of offensive defense is thin value betting. Instead of waiting to be bluffed, you bet small with slightly better hands. This takes away your opponent's ability to bluff, while still building profit. For instance, betting a weak top pair on the river denies them the chance to represent strength. You control the narrative. Turning defense into offense is not reckless. It's controlled assertion. You are not fighting emotion with emotion. You are using logic to flip the power dynamic. Bluffers rely on pressure. When you apply it back, they collapse. The moment you stop fearing bluffs and start countering them with structure, your entire game changes. Defense becomes confidence, and confidence becomes control. Chapter 19: Recognizing Unbalanced Opponents. Every poker player has habits. Some bluff too often. Others hardly bluff at all. Recognizing when an opponent's strategy becomes unbalanced allows you to adjust perfectly and exploit them. Once you learn to spot these imbalances, defending against bluffs feels less like guessing and more like simple observation. Start by tracking frequency of aggression. Players who bet every flop and continue firing turn after turn are likely over-bluffing. Their range becomes too wide, filled with weak hands that cannot stand pressure. Against this type, call lighter and let them pay for their own excess. Conversely, some players are under-bluffers. They bet only when strong and check when weak. Against them, you can fold more often without fear. Their aggression carries real weight. Every time they bet big, it's likely for value. Knowing which type you face saves countless chips. Board texture helps expose imbalance. An over-bluffer fires on boards that clearly favor your range, ignoring logic. For example, if the flop is 8, 7, 6, and your opponent raised pre-flop, they shouldn't bet that board too often. When they do, their story is thin. On the other hand, under-bluffers miss profitable opportunities to pressure you on favorable textures. Their caution gives away control. Pay attention to showdowns. Every time a hand reaches the end, you gain valuable data. Take note of what they showed after betting aggressively. Did they have value or air? Bluff-heavy showdowns reveal imbalance faster than anything else. A few clear examples can define their overall pattern. Bet sizing patterns also reveal imbalance. Over-bluffers often size bets inconsistently, alternating between small stabs and oversized bluffs. Under-bluffers prefer medium, steady bets that match strong hands. Each player tells a silent story through their chips. Once you identify imbalance, adjust without overreacting. Against over-bluffers, tighten your raising range and widen your calling range. Against under-bluffers, fold earlier and focus on extracting value when you hold strength. You do not need to fight every hand. Precision beats chaos. Balance is rare at most tables. The players who come closest to it are usually professionals. Everyone else drifts one way or another. Your goal is to notice that drift before they notice yours. When you do, you turn their predictability into steady profit. Chapter 20. Example Hands. Reading Bluff Lines. Theory becomes powerful only when it meets experience. These example hands illustrate how bluff detection works, step by step. Each one shows how logic, math, and awareness combine to reveal the truth behind aggression. Example 1. The inconsistent story. You call a raise with 9-8 suited. The flop comes king, 10, 4 rainbow. Your opponent bets large. You call. The turn brings a 2. They bet big again. The story feels weak. What strong hand bets so heavily on a harmless turn? You call once more. The river is a 3. They bet again, but the board hasn't changed since the flop. You call and they show Queen Jack for a missed straight. The key was noticing the broken story. The turn and river did not support their aggression. Example 2. The over-bluffer. You face a player who continuation bets nearly every hand. You call pre-flop with ace-7 of spades. The flop comes 9, 4, 2, with 1 spade. They bet again. You call. The turn is a queen. They fire a second barrel instantly. The card helps their perceived range but not their actual tendencies. You call again. The river brings a blank 5. They shove all in. You take a breath, trust the pattern, and call. They show Jack 10 for nothing. Recognizing over-aggression turned defense into profit. Example 3. The delayed bluff. You check the flop with top pair. Your opponent checks behind. The turn brings a blank. Suddenly they bet large. You call. The river changes nothing, and they shove all in. Their line doesn't add up. Why check the flop with a strong hand, then overbet later on? Safe cards. You call and win. The delayed aggression gave away the bluff. Example 4. The tight player. You play against a known under-bluffer. They rarely bluff and value bet consistently. They raise pre-flop and fire all three streets on a coordinated board. Even though you hold a decent hand, folding saves chips. Knowing their type keeps you from paying off real strength. Example 5. The emotional bluff. You see a frustrated player lose 2 hands in a row. On the next hand, they raise pre-flop and continuation bet on a dry flop. You call with middle pair. The turn changes nothing. They shove all in with shaky hands. Their anger is visible. You call, and they reveal a random bluff. Emotional patterns speak louder than math. Each example shows the same lesson. Bluff detection is not about guesswork. It's about collecting information, recognizing inconsistency, and trusting logic over emotion. The more you practice reading bluff lines, the less power aggression holds over you. Chapter 21. Managing Fear of Being Bluffed. Every poker player knows the sting of being bluffed. It feels personal, like a challenge to your pride. But emotional reactions are what bluffers rely on most. Learning to manage that fear gives you the calm, steady mindset needed to make logical decisions instead of emotional ones. The first step is acceptance. You will get bluffed sometimes. Every player does. Even professionals fold the best hand on occasion. The goal is not to eliminate being bluffed, but to reduce how much it affects your judgment. One correct fold against a real hand outweighs several small bluffs you could have caught. Ego fuels bad defense. Many players call too often, simply to prove they can't be pushed around. They treat the game as a test of toughness, not logic. Poker rewards patience, not pride. The moment you feel compelled to call just to catch a bluff, step back. Ask yourself whether the story makes sense, and whether the math supports the call. If not, folding is strength, not surrender. Another key to managing fear is long-term thinking. Poker is a game of averages, not single hands. When you make disciplined folds, you lose less money over time, even if a few opponents occasionally show bluffs. Over hundreds of hands, good decisions add up to profit. Emotional calls add up to loss. Practice emotional reset after tough hands. If you folded and later discover your opponent was bluffing, breathe and move on. That information is valuable. It tells you how they think, but it should not influence your next decision. Emotional carryover, known as revenge tilt, leads to chasing. Bluffers win most when you try to get even. Fear fades with preparation. When you understand pot odds, board texture, and opponent tendencies, you no longer guess. You decide. Confidence built from knowledge protects you from fear. Logical structure replaces insecurity. Finally, remember that being bluffed is not a failure. It is part of poker's balance. If no one could bluff you, the game would collapse. Your job is not to stop bluffs, but to choose when to fight them. The more you control your reactions, the less control bluffers have over you. Calm defenders do not fear deception. They expect it, study it, and profit from it. Chapter 22. Pot Control and Bluff Resistance. Pot control is a defensive tool that keeps you safe from unnecessary risk. It means managing the size of the pot so that future bets do not trap you. By keeping pots smaller, you limit the leverage opponents have when they try to bluff. Pot control starts early in the hand. When you have a medium strength holding, avoid building large pots without a clear plan. bet smaller, or check to see how your opponent reacts. Every chip you save gives you flexibility later. Bluffers rely on large pots to create pressure. Smaller pots reduce their power. In position, pot control is simple. You can check behind on certain streets, forcing opponents to reveal more information. For example, if you hold top pair with a weak kicker and face an uncertain board, checking the turn allows you to call a river bet safely. You keep the pot manageable while still controlling the outcome. Out of position, pot control requires discipline. Avoid leading into aggressive opponents unless you have strong hands. Instead, let them set the pace and respond calmly. If you sense pressure building, slow the action. A single check can stop a bluffer from inflating the pot beyond comfort. Pot control connects directly to bluff resistance. When pots stay small, opponents lose incentive to bluff. The risk-to-reward ratio shifts against them. Bluffing into a large pot offers reward. Bluffing into a small one does not. By reducing the stakes, you make their bluffs less profitable. Another benefit is clear decision-making. When the pot stays manageable, each call or fold carries less emotional weight. You can focus on logic, not fear. A small pot means small mistakes, and small mistakes are easier to recover from. Pot control also ties into value protection. When you do have strong hands, you can shift gears and build pots intentionally. The key is awareness. You choose when to grow or shrink the pot, based on control, not emotion. In short, pot control is about discipline and design. You decide how big the hand becomes. Bluffers lose their edge when they can't use pressure as a weapon. Each controlled pot is a shield, and each calm decision behind that shield adds consistency to your defense. Chapter 23. Value betting to punish bluffers. One of the best ways to counter aggressive bluffers is to punish them with value bets. Instead of waiting for them to make mistakes, you guide them into paying you off. Value betting is not just offense, it is defensive strategy, disguised as pressure. Value betting means wagering with the intention of being called by a worse hand. Against players who bluff often, you can expand the range of hands you bet for value. You no longer need the absolute nuts to build pots. Even top pair or second pair becomes strong enough when the opponent refuses to fold. The first step is identifying bluff-heavy players. These are opponents who bet frequently and represent strength too often. Once you know who they are, adjust by betting more of your medium-strength hands. Bluffers interpret betting as challenge. They respond by calling or even raising light. Both outcomes are profitable for you. Value betting requires control of sizing. Against loose, aggressive players, use smaller bets to keep them engaged. A 1/3 or half pot bet tempts them to continue. Against calling stations, you can go bigger. They will pay off regardless. Adjusting size ensures you maximize value without scaring them away. Timing also matters. Many players expect you to check after calling their earlier aggression. When you instead lead out with a value bet, it disrupts their rhythm. They may misread it as weakness and respond by bluff raising. This is exactly what you want. Their own aggression becomes fuel for your profit. Be careful not to slow play too often. Against bluffers, checking strong hands gives them free chances to realize equity. Instead, apply consistent pressure with real strength. Force them to keep making mistakes by calling or bluffing into superior holdings. Observation sharpens value betting. Track how your opponent reacts to your bet sizes. Do they fold often to large bets, but call small ones? Do they raise frequently when sensing weakness? These tendencies tell you how to price your value hands perfectly. Value betting against bluffers turns their strength into weakness. They thrive on pressure, but steady, logical betting removes their advantage. You control the hand by dictating the pace, size, and rhythm of the pot. They follow. You lead. Chapter 24. Recognizing when to fold. Folding is not failure. It is a sign of control and awareness. Knowing when to let go protects your stack and defines your longevity as a poker player. Every great defender understands that folding correctly is often more profitable than calling wrongly. The first step is logic over emotion. Ask whether your opponent's story makes sense. If every street follows a believable path, and their range includes strong combinations that beat you, folding is the smart choice. You do not need to test them to prove strength. The pot you save is just as valuable as the pot you win. Consider pot odds. If the price to call does not justify your hand's chances of being good, fold calmly. For example, if you must call $100 to win a pot of 200, you need to be right one time in 3. If your read tells you your opponent is bluffing less often than that, folding gains long-term profit. Board texture often decides the moment. When the board heavily favors your opponent's range, like when straight or flush possibilities complete, avoid calling without strong reason. Many players convince themselves to call just in case, ignoring how the texture changes strength distribution. Strong defenders see the shift clearly and let go without hesitation. Watch for timing cues. Some bluffs are instant, made before logic settles in. Others come after a long pause, revealing doubt. But the most convincing bets often arrive with calm, measured confidence. If your opponent's actions remain smooth and consistent through all streets, and the story fits, trust it. Stack size helps clarify tough spots. When deep stacked, you can afford occasional calls for information. When short stacked, discipline must tighten. Every chip matters more. Folding in marginal spots extends your play and keeps your bankroll safe for stronger opportunities. Most importantly, separate ego from decision-making. Folding feels like surrender, only to those ruled by pride. True professionals fold with calm certainty, knowing the game will offer better spots soon. The strongest players are not the ones who call most often. They are the ones who fold at the right time. Logic, not fear, drives their choices. Each fold builds trust in their process, and over time that trust becomes their edge. Chapter 25. Lesson Recap. Defending against bluffs is not about guessing right. It is about gathering information, staying calm, and applying logic under pressure. Every decision you make at the table, whether to call, fold, or raise, reflects your control over emotion and understanding of the story being told. In this lesson, we learned how to think clearly when facing aggression. Defense begins with psychology. Confidence replaces fear. Patience replaces ego. The calm player listens instead of reacting. Bluffers thrive on panic, and when you remove that panic, their weapon loses power. You studied patterns and timing, how rhythm, hesitation, and speed reveal more than words. You learned how bet sizing exposes inconsistencies, and how to read when aggression stops making sense. Every hand tells a story, and by comparing the action to logic, you find the truth hidden between the bets. We explored the mathematics of defense through pot odds and minimum defense frequency. Numbers protect you from emotional mistakes. They guide your calls and folds with reason instead of impulse. When the math supports your decision, you no longer fear being wrong. Position and board texture became your allies. Acting last gives clarity. Understanding how the cards connect gives context. Together, they turn reaction into prediction. You learned how to use your image to your advantage. A tight, disciplined image invites bluffs that you can profit from. At the same time, balance prevents opponents from exploiting you. You mix strong and weak hands, creating uncertainty that keeps them guessing. We covered how to spot over-aggression, manage fear, and use pot control to limit risk. You discovered how value betting punishes reckless bluffers, and how folding at the right moment is a sign of strength, not weakness. Every skill in this lesson connects to one theme: control. Bluffers win when you lose composure. Defenders win when they stay centered. Each calm decision builds long-term profit and quiet confidence. By mastering defense, you see the game from both sides. You understand not just how bluffs are made, but how they are broken. Chapter 26. Looking ahead to range thinking. The next step in your poker development is learning range thinking. So far, we have studied hands in isolation, yours versus your opponent's. Range thinking changes that view. It teaches you to see the entire set of possible hands each player could have, not just one. In the next lesson, you will learn how to analyze opponents logically based on position, action, and board texture. You will discover how to estimate the percentage of hands they play from each position, and how those ranges shift with aggression or passivity. We will explore range versus range analysis, how your likely hands interact with theirs across the board. You will learn to spot when your range dominates, when it trails, and when balance creates opportunity. These concepts explain why professionals rarely rely on gut feeling. Their decisions come from probability and structure. Range thinking also connects directly to defense. Instead of asking, "Does my opponent have it?" you will ask, "How often can they have it?" That question transforms uncertainty into measurable insight. It also refines your bluff catching and value betting decisions by grounding them in math rather than emotion. Finally, we will apply range thinking to real examples, showing how pre-flop choices influence post-flop decisions, and how narrowing ranges across streets reveals hidden patterns. Bluffing and defense are the heartbeats of poker. Range analysis is the mind that controls them. By combining psychology, logic, and probability, you move from surface-level play to complete strategic awareness. Lesson 8 taught you how to stay calm under fire. Lesson 9 will teach you how to see the entire battlefield.